The audio you're about to hear was recorded in Anchor. Learn more at anchor.fm.
Welcome
Hey, Alex.
to Alexander Schmid podcast episode 029. I'm here with Miss Sarah Miller, who I think you just heard there. Hey, Sarah, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Alex?
I'm doing well. Thank you for joining us from the East Coast. Out here on the West Coast, it's still pretty early, just after the teaching day, but you've had some downtime. It's about 7:00 there now, right?
It is. It's 7:15 or so. We've had an afternoon and in the evening, and yeah, after a long day.
Well, that's wonderful because, you're expanding our demographics in several ways on this podcast right now. Not only are you East Coast time and our first private school teacher, but you're also proving that the patriarchy of Wesley Shantz and the boys club has been broken up. And so now we're getting some diversity, not simply of opinion, but of gender as well. So
Yeah,
very interesting.
I spend my days smashing that patriarchy, I feel like, in my own small little way. So.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So why don't you tell us a little bit about where you teach and what you teach? Because you walk a slightly different path from me. I'm at a charter school out in California, and I've been blessed or lucky enough to to teach the great books, but it's a secular school and it's a public school, though it is charter. So where do you teach and what do you teach?
So I teach at a high school in Washington, D.C., called Gonzaga College High School. It is an all-boys Jesuit college prep school. So that means it's Catholic, private. The all-boys piece was something that when I started there over 8 years ago, I sort of balked at because I went to a co-ed Jesuit school in Seattle, and we always sort of made fun of the kids who went to all-boys schools because they didn't really know how to talk to girls.
that can be true of
or they
boys
were like,
at regular schools too.
Or they were like meathead, jacks or whatever, and both of those are definite stereotypes that I encounter, but I found that in my time there, they're really incomplete visions of what all boys education can provide a young man. It's definitely not the type of institution I think every boy would succeed at in the ages of 14 to 18, but there are some real developmental realities for which an all boys school is a virtue. And
what do you mean exactly by developmental realities there?
So for example, I taught co-ed for a couple years in Chicago before this, and things like the ability to sit still for more than 10 minutes or the neatness of handwriting. I think in a traditional classroom, especially when a teacher is not sensitive to how boys and girls are different, say at the age of 14 or 16 or 18, they just might unfairly and almost naturally compare a 14-year-old girl and a 14-year-old boy. Well, chemically, developmentally, they're just not necessarily at the same place. Now, that's not true for all boys, and it's not true for all girls. All of these gender differences, they're super generalized. But the truth is that
it sounds like you're not simply spouting off generalities, but that you have actually acquired several experiences and can now conceptualize based on those experiences real differences that you have observed in the classroom, where you have to keenly observe young men and women, and especially keenly observe the differences in their abilities at that age. Is that a correct assessment of what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, I'm by no means an expert. I haven't done all the reading. I think it was
sure, but you're in the field. You're not trying to claim a large body of research behind you. You're trying to report on your experience from what you've seen,
right?
And in order to be fair, right? So you are claiming these distinctions in order to be fairer to boys because they do worse than girls, because they do not yet embody the same level of articulation as they do, often illustrated in poor handwriting, often difficulty sitting still. In fact, we found some biological reasons for the difficulty sitting still part. boys are on average more aggressive than there are girls, and this can be shown simply by looking to prison. And the vast majority of people, I think it's 99%. It's at least 90, probably 99% male. And so what does that indicate? That at the top end of the normal distribution, the most aggressive humans are always men. So men can be more aggressive than women can to an extreme average.
Yeah.
And so,
and so like from my perspective, it's less about, what they can't do and more about, well, what's going to make boys respond to, questions or material or subjects or topics that they may not otherwise be jazzed about. So, I mean, I teach English, and in my senior class right now, I also teach some classical philosophy. And, you know, not every day are they jazzed about class. They want to talk about last night's game or some new video game, or they want to talk about something else. And finding ways to make who they are as a window into, or I guess a doorway into what they need to learn, you know, per our curriculum and our decisions about what we think is important that they learn. Things like using competition as a tool for managing behavior and incentivizing effort.
That's great. I was going to say competition is the best possible thing.
It's revolutionized
we found out
it's revolutionized the way that I manage a classroom. It's revolutionized the way that I think about cultivating community within the classroom. I've seen other teachers kind of take it to the next level with like a much more gamified system within the classroom and then across class sections, and that works and to an enormous degree. I haven't seen it in a girls' school, so I can't speak to that, but to make use of something that boys love, like video games, and again, not universally, but that so many of them know something about, and then to apply that structure to the adventure of learning, is a way for them to be equipped with a sense of confidence that, like, yeah, I can do this, or this
it's
is
interesting
in my
because
ballpark, you know.
We've actually found out that competition, and it's funny for modern relativistic claims based on nonsense and not on science. We found that the competition circuit is 350 million years old inside of us.
Right.
That we share it with lobsters. It's serotonergically governed, which means that, and since we've also figured out some very interesting things too, that, for example, we all exist within a dominance hierarchy, which also goes back to lobsters, in which we're keenly aware of status, and males are rewarded for competing successfully by increased amount of female attention. And you know, somebody can try and argue that a little bit, but it's like, well, no, that's a major difference between us and chimpanzees. We have choosy maters, and in fact, we honor that through the institution of marriage. Like, it's so embodied within us that it's one of the holiest things that we keep.
And so then,
cherished.
So then when you're when I'm in school, like, I'm in an environment where they're not competing for the attention of women or girls in the classroom. And so now.
Well, right. So actually that's part of it. So the men are always in competition with each other because they're chosen by the women to mate. So it doesn't matter where they are. They have been selected for in order to compete. And so to be at the top is where the resources are always, and which will lead to, in the future, increased amounts of, or increased selection availability. You might say. And so it's so deeply ingrained in them that it doesn't matter where they go.
The other thing that's sort of an interesting kind of, not paradox, but maybe something that cuts across that, is that a really important part of where I am is our Catholic identity, right? So, and not just Catholic, but like, really in the vein of the Ignatian charism for education and care for the whole person, and questions of, how what we're learning has relevance to, or, can be brought to bear upon the social and political realities of our world. And so asking them to participate in this kind of individualized competition, to be the best, to be the fastest, strongest, whatever. But also we from the very beginning, are a school that's really built on an idea of fraternity and, community. So, again, like team competitions, obviously, but, are important, but,
right.
But the philosophy of the school is that we're trying to graduate young men who are foreign with others. So,
well, that makes perfect sense too,
because competition, you know, that impulse.
Well, I see it as circumscribing the competition.
Yeah.
In order to actually have a competition, you need to set boundaries and rules. And then so there's a larger competition than simply doing well in school, right? And you actually called it to be a gentleman, which is interesting because that's a taboo term these days, but I would say that's exactly the right that's the right idea, because that's the competent individual who gets invited to the most amount of games. That's the person who right? So they get invited to game night. They get invited to this sport, that sport, because they're good at them. They get invited on this date. They get invited on this backpacking trip.
Because they're not that guy, you know?
Well, yes, because they are a gentleman. They are competent across dominance hierarchies, you might say. They are capable of playing many multifaceted games with different sorts of individuals in appropriate ways that it makes them good to be around. It makes them enjoyable to be around in diverse situations. That strikes me as an extraordinarily useful and good thing for somebody to learn with their time, rather than the fact that because they're aggressive, they're therefore evil and they should repress everything that's natural in them.
So we're also like located in an interesting place. We're about 8 blocks north of the United States Capitol.
Wow.
And you walk off campus, literally turn to your right on the sidewalk, and you can see the building. But
our symbol of the dominance hierarchy.
A symbol of the dominance hierarchy.
Doesn't it have a golden roof?
Sorry?
Yeah. Doesn't it have a golden ceiling?
There's probably some gold in the inside. I mean, there's certainly the painting of the apotheosis of Washington. Everything's giant and and evidence of our victories and whatever.
Well, in the apotheosis of Washington, that's pretty good because that actually is the dominance hierarchy, right? Because that's what's setting our ideal top guy, right? The guy who can turn down being king and be president, and boom, ideal American, there he is.
And so he may be, to use your phrase, the dominance, the dominant hierarchy.
The dominance hierarchy. Yeah. I got it from Jordan B. Peterson. Wes and I talk about it. We use it all the time, so it's normal parlance.
So to use that, that's what it is for the American man. And then we also temper that or challenge that really with like the figure of Christ and the figures of Ignatius and Gonzaga and other Jesuit saints in particular, but other figures within our church. So trying to teach them how to be men like in the world and of the world, but not of the world. So in it, but not of it. People who can navigate the world of Washington and the world that's beneath the world of Washington. So you turn to the right and you see the Capitol building, and you turn to the left and literally within 4 blocks there's Section 8 housing and an enormous amount of poverty, idleness, unemployment. I would argue despair as the consequence of a lot of those social factors. And, they're really at the an interface between poverty and power at the school. We have a homeless shelter or drop-in center for homeless men in the basement of the church that's on campus. So, and then a lot of our students take the metro to get to school. So from the metro to Gonzaga, you cannot get there without walking past someone who is experiencing homelessness, usually a man. And that is a really important part of their experience. And I talk about it a lot with them about what are you going to do with this experience that you have, this place that you're asked to be able to be a part of. Yeah, you're our students are going to be walking in the halls of power, even if it's a business or a law firm or a hospital, or they're going to be charting some new course in some new industry that I don't even know about. But they're also like, we're also asking for them to be, walking the halls of the margins as well. And that's a really
so you're not asking them to be in the margins,
we're not
to
asking
be
them
poor in these ways.
We're not saying that you know, that would be the Franciscan model, like cast off everything and
right,
and go be poor, and that is the only way to serve.
To be married to poverty.
Yeah, I think the idea is certainly in the Jesuit world, that is not the way they see their vocation. Jesuits, there's a joke that the Jesuits have vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and the only one that really matters is chastity, because they're really not that obedient and they don't live a poor life.
So something kind of interesting about what you said is that you mentioned that these are people who are going to walk the walls of power, and you talked about your Catholic identity, but not your Christian identity, really. But you know, I just recall that saying of Jesus that says, "But it'll be easier for you to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven." And so, do you find the Catholicism more of an apology against this fact of life? Because it seems like these are clearly people who come from privilege and are going to be privileged.
Yeah, most of them.
And so is the idea that they should feel bad about their privilege or
no.
I mean,
I think that,
or should they understand what true privilege is?
Right. Like I think that's the, I mean, isn't that one of the goals of what we're doing or certainly I would submit that the goal, one of the many things we're trying to do by the end of this 4-year high school experience is, and all of this is to also suggest, you know, in the background that there's only so much that a school can do.
Sure, of course.
I really do think that if some of the things
the parents are the first educators.
Yeah, and the last, you know, I would say, like, if there's, at the end of the day, if there's something that we're trying to do at school that's not at all reinforced at home or is contradicted at home, I mean, that's fighting the ocean.
But I'm legitimately interested in how you might have to confront that issue.
But to your question about faith, I don't think faith is a way of making them feel bad for what or like the religious aspects of our education framework in our school is a way of making them feel bad. I think.
Well, I don't think I was questioning faith. I think what I was wondering was whether the idea of the regard for the poor was an attempt to make the students feel a certain way about the fact that they have privilege. What exactly is that? What exactly is that feeling? I tried to connect that to the idea of the Matthew quote, that it would be easier for a rich man to pass through the eye of the needle. Is that being parsed out for them, really? Like, what's that supposed to mean, really?
So you know, so much of the Bible has these quotes about like the rich man and the eye of the needle, or the young rich man who Jesus tells, like, he says, like, he's done all the stuff. He's done all the studies. He does everything. He follows the rules, and he says, "What must I do to gain the kingdom?" And Jesus says, "Give away all your possessions and come and follow me." And
yes,
and he walks away sad. The young rich man does, because he doesn't want to give away his possessions. And we definitely have these conversations at school about what is going on there. Like, is Jesus saying that you can't be rich and be saved? And I don't.
Yeah, I'm interested in that.
That's not how. That's certainly not how I understand those passages. And that's not how I understand our encouragement for our guys to participate in service. So one of the things that I go with them like once a month, usually, maybe once every 6 weeks, with 3 sophomores on a Wednesday night. We go on a mobile soup kitchen called McKenna's Wagon. And it's associated with Father Horace McKenna, who is a Jesuit who kind of made a name for himself for serving the poor and the destitute in the DC area in the 60s, 70s, and 80s during the race riots, the rise of incredible amounts of poverty, and the rise of the war on drugs against the Black community in our city. So he made a name for himself, and a lot of social services inspired by his work are named for him. So we go on McKenna's wagon, and we go to 2 stops and give away hot food and cold food. And the 2 stops that we take the kids on with this wagon are literally next to the White House and are next to the World Bank and the White House. And on the way back, it's not a question about like, did you give from your excess? But what we're interested in with an encounter with the marginalized of any kind, the marginalized could be the disabled, the elderly and alone, the sick, the poor, the homeless, the mentally challenged, etc. Any encounter with the marginalized, we are more interested in the young men encountering them as human, and finding their own humanity, allied or intimately tied to the humanity of the other. So the homeless man or the migrant woman in Apopka, Florida, where we send a group of students to work alongside farm workers, or
Sure.
Yeah.
Let me jump in. There's a very interesting story of your school's movements throughout their social agenda. It's very clear what's happening. Very good. And so but I want to jump into that question a little deeper. Is what you're looking for from your students not to feel bad about that which they have, but to realize that true wealth is to give rather than true wealth is measured by what you have? Sort of like, so that strikes me as a great lesson.
Because that's part of what they're looking for. I think another part of it is that a proper understanding of who they are isn't at all tied to what they have. Even if what they have is something they earned, like a paycheck.
By that, do you mean that that's not all that they are? So like they're Catholic and therefore joined to like impoverished brother as well as wealthy aristocrat?
So like the rich young man, for example, or the rich man who cannot needle or something like that. I think one of the way that I've always heard that described, and to be fair, I've heard it explained in front of a fairly rich audience, and what priest wants to offend his rich audience by saying you can't be rich anymore. I think there probably are, by the way, some radical priests who would say, like, yeah, there's a point at which Catholics can't own 20 Bentleys. It's not okay. That's a misuse of wealth. But the point, our goal is to get them to properly understand their own foundational and important identity, which is not tied to where you're born. Where you're born does have an effect on who you are, of course.
Sure.
But the most important part or salient part of one's identity as a Catholic is child of God.
How do you understand that exactly? I'm pretty interested in that. So something we try and do on the show is we try and take a look at the expressions we use every day and see what we mean by them, because they're just so interesting. So and I'm not trying to really push you so much on that so much as, what sort of do you feel and think when you say that expression, child of God? Because I've noticed that sometimes using those sorts of expressions, depending on company, they can be polarizing because people on both ends of it, they misunderstand how it's being used, how those terms are being used. And it's like you're talking to another human, so it probably does mean something, right? So, I just want to, what does that mean exactly? Because, or to you?
Well, I'm sure. Yeah, I'm not an expert. I'm no theologian. So if some theologians listening and they're like, no, that's totally wrong. I'm sorry.
If there's a theologian listening, we're doing something right here.
That's right. So to me, a child of God means a couple things. It's sort of that's a phrase that, a teacher of mine in grade school used to say, so it means that, who we are is, beloved.
Okay.
Is known, intimately, like the way a parent knows a child. Is, protected, but not from suffering, but in suffering. So I don't think that that we are, nor should we, always be shielded from pain. I think pain is instructive, and
that's what the cross means, right?
Yes. And so to be a child of God means to not be alone in suffering, but to be like seen for one's like innate goodness and beauty. I mean, I'm in the process, and I'm sure you are too, of watching some of my friends become parents for the first time, and the way they talk about it, and the way they look at their child, kind of intimate bond is what I think we want all of our guys to know, that they can have, that God feels for them without them doing anything about it. They don't have to accept Jesus as their Lord and personal Savior. That's not what we're doing. But for them to come to know themselves, and then to come to know the other, whoever the other is, might be a kid in another school, it might be a kid somebody on the street, for them to see that the other is beloved of God in the same way that you are. As soon as you see that, and by see I mean maybe you don't see it with your eyes, but you see it like more internally, you feel it, because that's what our service program is designed to do. It's designed to elicit an emotional experience that you then think about and try to make meaning.
So that's really interesting. So I can see how that could connect directly to your working with those who are impoverished. Yeah. So if the three tenets of being a child of God are to be beloved, known, and protected, then that means that each person is beloved, known, and protected. And once you understand that about yourself, you understand it about everybody else. And by whom are they beloved, protected, and known? Well, of course, by the divine. And so that means that each person has individual dignity and value conferred on them by the divine. You can even see this notion underlying our democratic system.
Right.
As well. So when you see that, it draws you closer to each person around you, regardless of what your status is. And so you show them the people who, they would be least likely ever to associate with in any possible time. And you say, well, they've got, the belovedness, the knownness, and the protectedness too. And insofar as you can recognize that in them, perhaps you can know yourself better.
Right. That's what I meant when I say like come to know like a deeper or truer sense of who we are as individuals. And
Sure.
And I think that in theology this is called made in the image and likeness of God. Father Day, right, or something like that. But yeah, like and so the wider they understand that the conferral of that childhood, like the more people and kinds of people that they can understand are in their community, I think the less likely we are to draw lines and boundaries where people are left outside.
Well, Jesus washes the feet. What does that mean exactly? I think that means you have to continue to, then there's an Old Testament message too, right? You have to keep tending to the women and the children and the poor.
Yeah.
And that's why does a state even exist? It often limits those who are at the top of it, but it provides protections for those who are at the bottom. And that's the whole reason we have one, I would say. Besides as an edifice of war with other individuals. States. Right. But obviously the state exists to help the people out when they're having a tough time. Though I wouldn't say I'm not making a necessarily political, point there so much as it's like, who does the boat benefit the most? The weakest rower or the strongest rower? And well, I guess the answer is you would want the least difference as possible between each rower. And
ideally everybody benefits from the boat.
Yeah, and so actually that's very interesting. Yeah,
because
the biggest rower still needs the boat, that's for sure, and needs everybody else there too.
Well, and so if the biggest rower, so to use my students as an example, and I talk about this when I teach. So I teach a course in classic literature, in the fall of their senior year, and I teach a course in fantasy literature in the spring. And when we talk about like ancient Greek, and I also teach a honors sophomore English. In the fall, it's British literature. In the spring, it's world literature, where we like shoehorn in Oedipus and Antigone at the beginning. But at various points, like even when we're talking about when we're reading A Tale of Two Cities or Oedipus the King and Antigone, where the ship metaphor is like so huge, that idea that the city is a ship. When we're reading the Iliad or Florence and what Dante's doing with the city of Florence and the falsifiers and all of that, or when we read Hamlet and we talk about the city or the castle of Denmark, I try and get them to see themselves as members of a city state or a city of any kind, a civic unit of any kind, a neighborhood, a city, a state, whatever. And that as people who are literally, for the most part, born at the top, I want them to see that the inclusion of someone who isn't born at the top is beneficial to you, and like they therefore belong in the state with you. Now how that state is organized and what types of all that stuff is beside the point, but that like that I would submit that this kind of learning is very political, just not in the Republican or Democratic sense. But
more the Platonic sense, or the Aristotelian?
Much more in that sense.
Political. In fact, we found out that our very visual perception is tied to our social environment, and this is one of the reasons why, like, children will draw faces on everything, and why we say there's the man in the moon, because we're naturally adapted to the people around us, not to the environment at all. Well, to some extent, we have to survive within it. But if you look at us, what is our natural environment? We can live on Antarctica. We can live in Africa. We can live in, California, or in, out on the East Coast. We can live on a mountain. We can live on the water,
Right.
We can live anywhere. But again, then we have quotes like, but no man would, but a man would give up all else except a friend, and Aristotle. That our natural environment is a social environment, which is in fact what he and Plato claim. And so your guys seem to start at the top of that environment, and strike me as extremely important to educate with the appropriate values of the society. And it does sound like the part of what your Catholic identity does is to indicate that, for one, there are people at the bottom. For two, they have importance. For three, you need to know they exist, really.
And that your ultimate good is bound up in them as well as in others.
Because they're part of and you want them rowing.
Yeah, that's right.
And then they're feeling valuable too, and they are offering value, because I don't think part of what your claim is that people don't have differing levels of competency, and people, obviously everybody can do good. How much good would be a real question. Could you necessarily measure it yourself? Probably not, for sure. But does that mean there aren't differing levels? I don't think so.
Right.
I think the people that are at the top, the reason why you care so much about giving them these values is that potentially they can do the most good or harm on the other end.
Right. So that's an important part of what we're doing, is like they have capacity that some of them don't even know, right? They don't even know how much they have. And it can be frightening, I think. Doing really terrible things is horrible, but I think the wasted potential to do a lot of good is also really upsetting. That's the
most good. That's for sure.
Yeah,
not people being actively malevolent and evil. That would take people being active and focused and disciplined. For sure, we lose it on the potential end.
And I think some, at least currently, I don't know about you or how your students are these days, but February is so hard for them, and it's a rough time. It always is.
It's a little easier out where I am because it's beautiful weather, but it's still kind of rough. I mean, what's it like in DC right now? You must be covered in snow and cold and feeling terrible about everything.
It's not covered in snow. We've had a few snow days, which are absolutely ridiculous, because we go by some suburban county where a lot of our guys live. And so but like they haven't really been real snow days. It's been like an ice day, like, oh my God, like there's ice on the ground, you know?
Yeah. We had those where I grew up occasionally, Atlanta.
Yeah. So it's like every now and then, we'll get a real snowstorm here, and that's pretty fun, but we haven't had one yet, and it's the middle of February, and at this point, I'm really hoping we don't get one, because
right.
Yeah, we've already lost enough days to the ice and like these no storms, and then, you know, I thought it's weird when it's March and you have like a blizzard. That's not normal, unless you're living in Maine. It's not normal in the Mid-Atlantic. So what are you teaching these days? You're not still doing Dante, are you?
Yeah, well, so believe it or not, so when I found out that that the Italians spend a year on each canticle, on the Inferno for 1 year, the Purgatorio 1 year, and the Paradiso 1 year, or at least an Italian date of mine made that claim. Who knows whether she was lying or not, but who would lie about that sort of thing? Right. And so I've had the luxury to spend the first semester on the Inferno and the Purgatorio, and now we're just past halfway into the Paradiso. In fact, I was in the holy sphere of Mars just today talking about the living crucifix embodied by the living souls that are constantly changing place while maintaining the same form within the red planet. And we were considering, yeah, I know, and the students are so brilliant. We were considering thoughts like these, like what does the red of Mars indicate with the holy warriors? The violence in which they enacted their lives and what they embodied, or the charity with which they all gave their lives as martyr. And it's like, oh man, I think it joins both those together actually. And well, gosh, that's incredible. And it's like, why are they up there if they were fighters and violent and mean? It's like, well, actually they were martyrs. They were people who gave their lives for what they believed in. And, you know, I recall that being a Pauline argument for the existence of the divine, and I think that is a fairly provocative argument for anything a human could make. If you are willing to sacrifice your life for something, does it have transcendent value? Yeah. Answer, yes, it has to. Because what else would you sacrifice your life for? You know what I mean? Yeah. I mean, I think even to some extent at the negative example, and I bring this up especially today with 19 dead in Florida, that's exactly what a mass shooting is trying to represent, the existence of malevolence in the world to shock people out of their good-natured assumptions about people and things, and to show just how violent we can be, even to each other. Yeah.
It's it's without order to me. It's like that to me.
It's like, completely disordered. It is an attempt at disorder.
I don't know what the word is. It's not, it's the height of, out of placeness.
It's trying to throw the apple of Paris. Yes.
Yeah.
It's trying to throw discord into order. It's trying to express pure hate and something, so much hate in a system that bolstered someone up that hopefully it could collapse. It's like the massive resentment, which is interesting because that's why those individual efforts by shooters, they're so unsuccessful. It's like, no, you have to be more like the Soviet Union where you put people in camps who don't deserve to be in the tens of millions. And then you'll probably collapse because of the collective resentment of your own people. That's for sure. And it's like, oof. And you know, it's funny where I was actually talking to the students a little bit about this, and I was like, do you know often why these killers commit suicide? And this is just some insight into the act of evil itself, which is, well, if they gave some account, do you think you'd understand why they did it a little better? Like, I'm not saying justify it necessarily, but if somebody said, you know, they were beaten and abused, totally terrible things happened to them for like 15 straight years, and then they did something like this, I think you'd be like, I wouldn't have done it in their shoes. Who knows? But I understand a little more. But if they commit suicide afterwards, it's, well, what do they deny us? Any account of why they did it. Any explanation, which is totally disorienting for us, right? That's sort of like Dante in Dark Wood when he first starts. It's like, I didn't see this coming at all. I have no idea why it happened.
Right.
And, it's like, that's literally, or figuratively actually, but seemingly literally, not going up or down.
Yeah.
Kind of like that expression I just gave.
Yeah.
But, I mean, that's disorientation, I would say. It's just like, oh my gosh, how did this thing that I didn't even know could happen? And now I don't know the reason why, and now I can never know why, and now we have to deal with the consequences of it too, so we have to be actually very ordered and good to each other in a moment after pure chaos.
Yeah. Yeah, it's horrifying.
It's horrifying. It's terrible. It's terrible that these sorts of things keep happening too. And
yeah.
I try
and do you guys do drills at your school for like intruders or guns, like shooting drills?
Not all the time, but I think we do the legally mandated and appropriate amount. We're all sort of aware of our legal responsibilities and how we're supposed to conduct ourselves, but we don't. It's not like we're constantly getting under our desks, like we're preparing for thermonuclear destruction.
Yeah. No, but do you guys have a shooting specific drill? Because I know that there are schools that do now, that like there are school districts where like they have their fire drill, their earthquake drill, they have a shooter drill.
We occasionally we have differing sorts. I don't know how much I'm even allowed to talk about these, but we have like a couple kind of drills like that.
Yeah.
But nothing where we're doing nothing yet where we're doing specific maneuvering. But mostly we do things like fire drills, or like generalized intruder drills.
Yeah. Yeah. Us too. But I'm curious. I'm curious.
We don't have a firearm specific one yet.
Yeah.
I'm actually pretty interested now in what that would entail and whether that would involve any operations, because mostly you just try and keep the kids safe, and hope that the police get there fast, and they generally do. They generally do.
Yeah.
Fire department too. It's nice. It's good.
So you guys are reading
again with chaos. That would, if we did not have these wonderful services, it's like,
oh God. Yeah. Chaos.
Right. Exactly. It's like these situations. It's funny. This situation, ultimately, if you look at it in the right way, that person, a stop was put to him, and there are people now working very hard to put people's lives back together and to get them healthy and to get their bodies healthy now. And those are all forces of good, you might say. People in society who are trying to help people out. And well, even though this atrocity happens, it's bringing the good out of people. Where people are responding with the best they have.
Well,
so even that proves there's good.
That brings up something interesting, like, so I'm teaching, one of my favorite books right now, which is The Narrative of the Life of a Slave by Frederick Douglass. Did you have to read it in like college or?
No.
I don't think it's at St. John's. It's so good. It's perfect for this particular age. It's with the honors sophomores. It's a really like linguistically challenging text.
Okay.
And then when you add in the fact that he was a slave and taught himself to read and write, it's all the more impressive. That, somebody who didn't have the benefit of a traditional education can write like that. And
for sure.
He employs so much religious imagery and religious language, because one of his arguments is to point out like the massive hypocrisy of the religious justification for slavery in the South at the time. But, so it's also, today's his birthday, or the day that he celebrated his birthday, and it would be his 200th birthday today.
Happy birthday, Frederick Douglass.
Happy birthday, Frederick Douglass. He never knew what his real birthday was, but he picked Valentine's Day just like kind of as a goof or as a gimmick. Anyway, so he was held as a slave, here, or like nearby in Maryland, about an hour away from Gonzaga's campus in a place called St. Michael's. And it's on the Eastern Shore, just past like Solomon's Island. I mean, like basically you go to Annapolis and you keep going for like double the time that it took to get, or like another half hour that it took to get you there, from DC. And, so it's super interesting because it's really local. But then this past summer, well, you know that like a couple years ago, Georgetown, released like a report acknowledging the sale of 272 enslaved persons, the profit of whom enabled Georgetown to like buy parts of its campus. Do you remember hearing that? And they're going through this process.
But now I know.
Yeah. So it came out a couple years ago, and they're going through this process of attempts at like reconciliation and not reparations financially per se, but I know that Georgetown has offered like free tuition basically, or like remitted tuition to anybody who can demonstrate familial lineage with the 272 people who were enslaved and then sold. So there are people now at Georgetown.
You're industrious enough to look that sort of thing up, then.
Yeah. There are
exactly
people,
what Georgetown was.
There's like a current freshman who's like in her 60s and going to Georgetown for free.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, so Georgetown was a member of Georgetown was governed by the Maryland province of Jesuits, and so was Gonzaga, or what used to be called Gonzaga College, which was a seminary in like the 1820s. It was founded in 1821, and it was, if the Maryland province had slaves that Georgetown benefited from, basically one of my coworkers brought the history professor from Georgetown to talk to his students, and it sort of inspired these like 6 or 7 students to go to Georgetown this past summer and to look through accounting books and ledgers and letters and all of these kind of primary source historical documents that Georgetown has access to ask the question of, did our school benefit from slave labor? Were there slaves or enslaved persons at our school ever? And the answer, of course, is yes. And that's what they found. And they spent 2 weeks at Georgetown, and they found like irrefutable evidence showing the movement of money and food and persons between these plantations out on the eastern shore of Maryland and the Maryland province's properties in the what is now DC area. So Gonzaga College, Georgetown Prep, and Georgetown University. And anyway, it's a remarkable presentation. I had a couple of the students come in and give it to my sophomores as we were reading Frederick Douglass, because the truth is like where the province owned slaves and used them out on the plantations was probably within 5, maybe 7 miles of where Douglass would have been a slave. And so just so close, so proximate to their lives, and yet so not at all close to their lives. And then we had this discussion yesterday that just blew my mind. It's like the type of shit that sorry, are we allowed to swear? I don't know.
Go ahead.
It's like the type of shit that like I live for as a teacher, like that teachable moment where something that you're doing in some old archaic or seemingly archaic text gets really relevant to your day. Like in the wake of the election, when we were reading the Inferno, and like we had a conversation about being each other's keeper and how Cain fails there, and sort of the sinners in the vestibule of hell also failed to be anybody's keeper. And those types of teachable moments where like something becomes just real imminent, real fast. We talked about like all kinds of things yesterday. The kids had all kinds of questions about like how important it is to ask questions that are maybe going to get you an ugly answer, and how you have to ask the questions anyway. Or, how do we make a memorial for this? How do we like remember this kind of thing?
Well, I think the important thing is to remember these sorts of things, because this tells one exactly what human nature is, and that which does not change. And so regardless of one's social or political stance, to not acknowledge history is simply to forget what's true about humans.
Right.
And that doesn't seem to do much good for any humans, regardless of their political motivations.
And one thing that one of my students, like, he's super awkward, and he stopped stopped me after class ended and the bell had rung, and he said, like, Miss Miller, do you think Gonzaga would exist if we didn't have slaves? Or like, and I said, well, I don't think it's that simple, Andrew, like, I think the way that the evidence that they found was that, the money from, selling slaves or the labor produced by slaves that yielded a profit furnished the money to purchase the land on which Gonzaga was ultimately built in its first iteration, or people in our school community ate food that was made by enslaved persons. Like, I don't know if it's so direct that, like, it wasn't like the selling of human beings, but he said, like, do you think that we would be?
Are you suggesting there are demarcations of evil? That makes you evil. That's in a foolish perspective. It's like, why would you not want to make the most dangerous thing clearer?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like, obviously, just like if you if you give me a dime, it's not the same thing as if you give me $1,000.
Well, and also, like, I don't want them to go home and to say, like, to miss the nuance. And I'm not trying to, like, minimize what the Maryland province of priests
the nuance
did.
is reality.
Right.
It's not simply intellectual flourish.
Right.
That's the detail is the reality,
Yeah.
not the generalization.
And they're already, sophomores are already maybe not so good with nuance at that age. And so, anyway,
they haven't gotten there.
So I tried to give them a little more nuanced perspective, and I said, I'm not excusing what they did. Like, let's be real. These were priests. These were men of the cloth who were either okay with this or didn't know that they could ask a question, or, like, we can chalk it up to the world in which they lived, but that's not good enough for me, and, like, all these things. And I said, but you know what, Andrew, like, I believe in a God that is so much bigger than all of this, and, like, for every shit thing that human beings do to each other, there is good that, like, somehow gets drawn out of it that I don't even always understand. And I'm not saying that justifies. That's not what you ever say to somebody who just lost a child, right?
No, but I get what you're saying, because it's like, who's the good going to come from, like, if not from us?
Yeah, I wanted him to know that, like, yes, like, this evil that I just made you look at, or the consequences of evil that I just made you look at, or the evidence of evil, these ledgers or whatever, I made you look at that, and we're reading this narrative that details evil in a really graphic way at times. I'm forcing you to read it. But I don't want you to think that, like, that is the end of the story. And like, he's super awkward. So, and this is like a little humble brag afterwards. He goes, Miss Miller, there aren't very many times when, like, I hear a teacher say something that's gonna stick with me. Like, he's so awkward. He was trying to pay me a compliment, I think, that he was glad that I said that. But yeah, like, just that's a long way of kind of connecting to your comment about the firefighters and the people who are going to help these people put their lives back together, and how good that is. And, like,
right. And I actually wanted to help close with that. And, like, what I saw from what you were saying there, and I'm really happy you saw that connection too, because, right, if evil is a real presence, which it clearly is if we just open our eyes,
right,
how much more important is good then? Because if we simply act as if evil doesn't exist while evil things happen around us, like mass shootings, and one can say that's a relative definition. And it's like, sure, exactly. That's relative to going about your business normally every day, or even the petty crimes you commit on the internet through downloading music or movies or whatever you do. Yes, those are different actions. That killing other people, especially at a school, is trespasses on so many moral norms that it enters the category of evil, which means that there is a contrasting category of good and a demarcated, we can demarcate it, and there are differing intensities of it, and we certainly need much, much more of it.
Yeah.
And not believing in its existence does just as little good as not acknowledging evil's existence does to expiate the existence of evil. That's like the Minister of Magic in Harry Potter refusing to see Voldemort.
Which is, I mean, so just side note, that's my favorite. Yeah. That's why I teach the fantasy lit classes, because we get to talk about good. I mean, we're in the middle of the Fellowship of the Ring right now, and they're about to like have the Council of Elrond and talk about, can the ring be used for good? And that's their reading for tonight. And it's a long ass.
We got to talk about that. Okay. Just because it'll be impossible for us ever to stop. That is a great. We need to talk about that next time then. Let's talk about Harry Potter and some Lord of the Rings.
Got it.
Because I'm watching through the Harry Potters right now because I want to teach a course on the Harry Potters and the Lord of the Rings. And so I need to ask you a ton of questions on air about, oh my goodness.
I've taught both of those, or pieces of both of the series for like 4 or 5 years now. So.
Oh wow. I'm going to ask you, maybe you can even tell me the questions to ask you, because this is going to be a feast.
Okay.
This is going to be a real feast. So an unexpected feast.
Does that mean that I get to be asked back for the next one?
Yes, I think we're going to be asking you back, Miss Miller. Yay! Miss Sarah Miller.
Say hi. Will you say hi to Wes for me, or if Wes is listening? Hey, Wes.
Yeah, Wes is a big time listener, and I will say hi to him. We're scheduled to talk, I think, in the next couple days here.
Okay.
Maybe even tomorrow, depending on scheduling. And so please listen in to us too, because he's for sure going to have something to say about what you had to say as well. And I know that, he comes from Gaithersburg, which is not super close to DC, but much closer than where I am, even though he's out on the West Coast like I am now. Well, not technically the coast.
Is he still in Phoenix? Yeah.
He's in the eastern, he moved up to Washington, and so now he's.
Shut up, that's my hometown, that's my home state.
I know you're from Seattle, and which I love, and,
so great.
He's in Spokane.
Oh yeah. Cool.
All right, well.
Sorry we went over next time. To be continued.
To be continued, and an unexpected journey and an unexpected feast await us. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for being here. All right, talk to you later. Talk to you soon.
All right. See ya. Bye.
The audio you just heard was recorded in Anchor. Learn more at anchor.fm.